"Do you even know where you are, old man?" The voice was sharp, honed by discipline, and steeped in an arrogance that only youth and proven lethality could forge. Lieutenant Miller, a Navy SEAL whose physique seemed carved from granite, stood with his arms crossed, his shadow falling over the stooped figure before him. The man, Dennis Whitaker, looked every bit of his 83 years. He wore simple khaki pants, a worn blue polo shirt, and a faded baseball cap that did little to shield his weathered face from the relentless Coronado sun. He stood on the edge of the grinder, the sacred asphalt courtyard where SEALs are forged in pain and perseverance. Dennis's eyes, a pale but clear blue, were not on the formidable lieutenant. They were fixed on the obstacle course in the distance, lost in a memory half a century old. He didn't answer immediately, his silence seeming to grate on the officer's perfectly tuned nerves. "This is a restricted area," Miller pressed, stepping closer. A younger SEAL, a petty officer who mirrored Miller's posture, flanked him. "This isn't a museum. It's a training ground for the most elite warfighters on the planet, not a VFW hall for you to wander through and relive your glory days." Dennis finally turned his head, his gaze slowly moving from the horizon to the lieutenant's face. There was no anger in his eyes, no fear, only a profound and unsettling calmness. "I have permission," he said, his voice quiet, raspy with age but steady. Miller let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Permission? From who? The ghost of Chesty Puller?" He gestured dismissively at Dennis's attire. "Look at you. You walk onto the Naval Amphibious Base, wander into the heart of the Naval Special Warfare Center, and think a simple, 'I have permission' is going to cut it. I need to see your authorization, your ID." Now, slowly, with the deliberate movements of old age, Dennis reached into his back pocket and pulled out a worn leather wallet. It had been with him for decades, its creases holding the memory of places Miller had only read about in history books. From it he produced an old laminated identification card, the photo a ghost of a much younger man with the same clear eyes. Miller snatched the card from Dennis's hand. He glanced at it, a smirk playing on his lips. "Dennis Whitaker, this thing expired before I was born." He flipped it over. "No rank, no unit affiliation. This is a civilian contractor ID from the 70s. This is worthless." He flicked the card back at Dennis's chest. It fluttered to the ground. Dennis bent down with a soft grunt of effort to retrieve it. As he did, his other hand, which had been resting in his pocket, came into view. It was curled around a small metallic object. Miller's eyes narrowed. "What's in your hand?" he demanded, his voice dropping into a command tone. Dennis opened his palm. Resting in the center was a single worn silver dollar, its edges smooth from years of handling, a deep gouge marring the face of Lady Liberty. The younger SEAL chuckled. "What's that?" "Your good luck charm." Miller was less amused. His professional suspicion, always simmering just below the surface, boiled over. To him, this was a breach. An unknown, unauthorized civilian in the most sensitive part of the base, acting strangely. He saw a threat, or at least a nuisance that needed to be neutralized. The fact that the man was old and seemingly frail was irrelevant. The rules were the rules. "I think you and I are going to have a talk with base security," Miller said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "This little field trip of yours is over." He took a step forward, intending to place a hand on Dennis's arm and escort him away. A small crowd had begun to gather. A platoon of Bud/candidates on a water break watched from a distance, their faces a mixture of curiosity and intimidation. A few instructors, their expressions unreadable, paused their work to observe the unfolding scene. The public nature of the confrontation seemed to fuel Miller's need to assert his authority. He was the guardian of this sacred ground, and he would not have it defiled by some confused old man. "Sir, that's not necessary," Dennis said, his voice still unnervingly calm. "I'm just here to pay my respects." "Respects to who?" Miller shot back. "The monkey bars. This isn't a cemetery." He pointed a rigid finger at the main gate. "You are leaving now, either on your own 2 feet or in handcuffs. Your choice." Dennis Whitaker's gaze drifted past the lieutenant, back towards the grinder. His hand tightened around the silver dollar in his pocket, the cool metal a familiar anchor in the swirling current of the present. The sharp, arrogant voice of the young SEAL faded into a dull drone, replaced by the hiss of rain and the suck of mud. The air, thick and humid, tasted of gunpowder and fear. It was the Mekong Delta, 1968. He wasn't 83, he was 24. Lean and hard, crouched in a flooded foxhole beside a kid from Ohio named Bobby. Rain plastered their hair to their foreheads. A firefight raged around them, the jungle erupting in flashes of green and orange. Bobby, barely 19, was trying not to let his teeth chatter. He pressed something cold and heavy into Dennis's hand. It was a silver dollar. "My dad gave it to me." Bobby yelled over the din of automatic weapons fire. "For luck. You hold on to it for me, Denny. You got better pockets." Dennis had just nodded, tucking it away, his focus on the tree line. That was the last thing Bobby ever said to him. The coin had been in his pocket ever since. He blinked, and the jungle was gone. The Coronado sun was back, hot and bright. The arrogant young officer was still there, his face a mask of impatience. Dennis simply looked at him, the memory giving him a placidity the SEAL couldn't possibly comprehend. From the edge of the growing crowd of onlookers, Seaman Apprentice Peterson watched, a knot tightening in his stomach. He was fresh out of A school, assigned to a logistical support unit on the base. He knew exactly who Lieutenant Miller was. Every junior sailor knew the SEALs were gods here, and you didn't look them in the eye unless you were told to. But Peterson's grandfather had been a corpsman at the Chosin Reservoir, a quiet man who carried a deep well of pain behind his eyes. He had taught Peterson one thing above all others: respect your elders, especially the ones who have been through the fire. What he was witnessing felt profoundly wrong. It wasn't just the disrespect, it was the sheer public nature of the humiliation. Miller was making an example of this old man, and no one was stepping in. Peterson felt a surge of something hot in his chest, a mix of fear and indignation. He was a nobody. Intervening directly would be career suicide. The lieutenant would chew him up and spit him out without a second thought. But he had to do something. He remembered the orientation briefing, the dozens of phone numbers they were told to memorize. One of them was for the office of the base commander, Captain Wallace. It was for emergencies, they'd said, for situations that required the highest level of attention. Peterson had scoffed at it then. What kind of emergency would a seaman like him ever report to the base CO? This felt like one. Slipping away from the edge of the crowd, he found a quiet spot behind a barracks building, his heart pounding against his ribs. He pulled out his cell phone, his fingers fumbling as he dialed the number. A crisp, professional voice answered. "Captain Wallace's office." "Yes, ma'am," Peterson stammered, his own voice sounding small and reedy. "This is Seaman Apprentice Peterson. Is there an immediate threat, Seaman?" The voice on the other end was patient but firm. "No, not a threat exactly." Peterson struggled to find the right words. "It's Lieutenant Miller. He's detaining an elderly civilian. He's being very aggressive, ma'am. In front of everyone." There was a pause. "And this civilian's name?" The old man said it. He said his name was Whitaker. Dennis Whitaker. He expected to be dismissed, to be told to report it through the proper channels, to call the master-at-arms. Instead, there was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line, followed by a silence that stretched for a full 5 seconds. It was a silence so absolute, so heavy with unspoken meaning, that the hair on Peterson's arms stood up. When the voice returned, all professional calm was gone. It was replaced by a raw, naked urgency. "Seaman, where exactly are you? Describe the location." "Precisely." The pen in his hand slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the polished surface of his desk. His face, usually a stern mask of command, went ashen. He looked at his aide, his eyes wide with a disbelief that bordered on horror. "Whitaker," he repeated, the name barely a whisper. "The Phantom." His aide just nodded, swallowing hard. Wallace didn't need to hear another word. He slammed his laptop shut, cutting off a 2-star admiral mid-sentence. "Get the Master Chief," he barked, his voice a low growl that vibrated with sudden immense energy. "Get my vehicle. Tell them to clear a path to the BOD/compound. Move. Now." He was already shrugging on his jacket and striding towards the door before the aide had even turned to leave. Dennis Whitaker was on his base, and a young lieutenant was harassing him. To Captain Wallace, who had studied naval history with a near-religious fervor, this was more than an embarrassing incident. It was sacrilege. It was like finding a janitor yelling at the Lincoln Memorial. Back at the grinder, Lieutenant Miller's patience had finally evaporated. The growing crowd of onlookers was beginning to unnerve him, and the old man's infuriating calm felt like a personal insult. He had given him a choice, and the man had chosen defiance. He was going to end this. "All right, that's it," Miller said, his voice flat and cold. He reached out and wrapped his powerful fingers around Dennis's thin bicep. "You've got a date with the base psychologist. Maybe they can figure out what's wrong with you." The act was the final, unforgivable overreach. It was one thing to be verbally abusive, to be arrogant and dismissive. It was another thing entirely to physically lay hands on the old man, to threaten him with a forced evaluation, to treat him not just as a trespasser but as someone who was mentally unwell. Dennis didn't flinch, didn't resist. He just looked down at the hand on his arm, a flicker of something ancient and weary in his eyes. It was at that precise moment that the atmosphere on the grinder shifted. It began not with a siren, but with a presence. A black command SUV, followed by a larger personnel truck, swept onto the asphalt with an urgent but controlled speed, their tires barely making a sound. They came to a halt a dozen yards from the confrontation. The doors opened in unison. From the SUV stepped Captain Frank Wallace, his uniform immaculate, the 4 silver stripes of his rank gleaming on his shoulder boards. Beside him emerged the base command Master Chief, a man whose craggy face looked like it was carved from the same rock as Mount Rushmore. His presence alone was enough to make the air crackle. The entire area fell into a deafening silence. The boat/candidates snapped to attention as if struck by lightning. The instructors stiffened, their eyes locked on the approaching command element. Lieutenant Miller froze, his hand still on Dennis's arm. His mind raced, trying to comprehend why the base commander himself would be here. He assumed it was about him, a surprise inspection, and he had been caught in the middle of this ridiculous situation. His grip on Dennis's arm tightened, a fatal mistake. Captain Wallace's eyes scanned the scene, his gaze sweeping over the crowd, over the younger SEAL, and finally landing on Lieutenant Miller and the old man. His face was a thundercloud. He ignored Miller completely, his focus absolute. He strode forward with a purpose that parted the air in front of him, the Master Chief a half-step behind. He did not stop until he was standing directly in front of Dennis Whitaker. Miller, confused and suddenly very nervous, let go of Dennis's arm. "Captain," he began. This civilian was in a restricted. Wallace cut him off without a glance, raising a single hand. He then turned his full attention to Dennis. His entire demeanor changed. The anger vanished, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated reverence. He drew himself up to his full height, his back ramrod straight, and executed the sharpest, most profound salute of his long and distinguished career. His hand was a rigid blade at his brow. "Mr. Whitaker," Captain Wallace said, his voice resonating across the silent courtyard. It was not the voice of a commander addressing a subordinate, but of a student addressing a master. "It is an honor to have you on my base, sir. I apologize for the reception you have received." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Lieutenant Miller stared, his mouth hanging slightly open, his brain refusing to process what he was seeing. The base commander was saluting this decrepit old man, calling him sir. Wallace held the salute for a long moment before dropping his hand. He then turned to face the assembled sailors and SEALs, his eyes blazing with a fire that made Miller feel physically small. "Do you know who this is?" Wallace boomed, his voice carrying to every corner of the compound. He didn't wait for an answer. "This is Dennis Whitaker. You candidates," he said, gesturing towards the stunned recruits. "You run on this grinder, you bleed on this asphalt, you push your bodies to the absolute limit trying to live up to a legacy. Gentlemen, this man is that legacy." He took a step closer to Miller, his eyes boring into the younger officers. This man was a boatswain's mate in one of the very first underwater demolition teams. Before there were SEALs, there were men like him, men who swam into enemy harbors with nothing but a knife and a block of C4, men who wrote the book that you now take for a sacred text. The silence was now so profound that the sound of the distant surf was clearly audible. The word was spreading. Sailors walking by stopped in their tracks. The news rippled through the nearby buildings, whispered over radios. On the far side of the base, activity slowed to a crawl as everyone who could turned their attention toward the grinder, an invisible wave of respect washing over the entire facility. Wallace wasn't finished. His voice rose with passion. In 1968, in the Mekong Delta, his 7-man team was ambushed, outnumbered 20-1. Their radio was destroyed, their officer killed in the first volley. For 18 hours, Dennis Whitaker single-handedly held off a reinforced company of Viet Cong. He moved from position to position, wounded 3 times, creating the illusion of a much larger force, allowing the surviving members of his team to be evacuated. When the rescue Huey finally arrived, they found him unconscious, propped against a tree, surrounded by the bodies of more than 50 enemy soldiers. For his actions that day, he was awarded the Medal of Honor. Wallace paused, letting the weight of his words settle. He turned his gaze back to the crowd. There is a reason he is called the Phantom of the Mekong, because to the enemy he was an unstoppable ghost, to his teammates he was a guardian angel, and to the United States Navy he is a living legend, and he is standing on our hallowed ground. With that, Captain Wallace turned back to Dennis and saluted again. The Command Master Chief followed suit. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, every single person in uniform on that grinder, instructors, candidates, onlookers, snapped to attention and rendered a salute. It spread beyond the courtyard, a silent, reverent wave. Sailors on the sidewalks, officers in their doorways, all turned and saluted in the direction of the old man they could not see. honoring the name that had just been spoken with the force of scripture. The entire base, for one long, breathtaking minute, saluted Dennis Whitaker in utter silence. Lieutenant Miller stood frozen, the blood draining from his face. The world had just been turned upside down. The frail old man he had mocked, threatened, and physically assaulted was a giant, a foundational pillar of the very community he prided himself on belonging to. He felt a shame so deep and so searing it was like a physical illness. After lowering his salute, Captain Wallace turned to Miller. The fire in his eyes was gone, replaced by a glacial coldness that was far more terrifying. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't have to. "Lieutenant," he said, his voice a low, deadly whisper. "My office, 0800 tomorrow. Bring your commanding officer. You and I are going to have a long discussion about the meaning of respect." He paused. "And then you're going to pack your bags. Your time as a platoon commander is over." The words struck Miller with the force of a physical blow. It was the end of his career as he knew it. He could only manage a choked, "Yes, sir." Dennis Whitaker, who had stood through the entire ordeal with the same quiet dignity, took a small step forward. He looked not at the captain, but at the broken young lieutenant. He raised a hand, not in anger, but in a gesture of peace. "Captain," Dennis said, his voice gentle. "The boy was just doing his job. He's young, full of fire. I was the same way once." He then looked directly at Miller, his pale blue eyes holding no malice, only a deep, abiding wisdom. "The uniform doesn't make the man, son," he said softly. "The man honors the uniform. You wear the same trident I once did. Don't ever forget what it stands for. It stands for the man next to you. It stands for the ones who didn't come home." As he spoke those last words, his gaze fell to the silver dollar still clutched in his hand. The hiss of rain, the smell of mud and blood. Bobby was lying in the water, his eyes fading. He was trying to smile. "Make it home, Denny," he whispered, his breath a faint cloud. He pressed the coin into Dennis's hand one last time. Tell them we tried." Dennis had held that coin and that promise for over 50 years. It wasn't for luck. It was for remembrance. It was the weight of the men he had to leave behind. The fallout from that day was swift and decisive. Lieutenant Miller was, as promised, relieved of his command. He wasn't kicked out of the SEALs. Captain Wallace believed in correction more than simple punishment. Instead, Miller and his entire platoon were reassigned. Their new duty for the next 6 months was to develop and implement a new training module for all West Coast-based Naval Special Warfare units. The module was called Naval Heritage: The Foundations of the UDT and SEAL Teams. Miller's first assignment was to write a 200-page paper on the operational history of the UDT in Vietnam, with a special focus on the actions of Medal of Honor recipients. It was a humbling, educational, and ultimately transformative penance. The base issued a formal public apology to Dennis Whitaker, though he had requested they do no such thing. He had already forgiven the young lieutenant, seeing in his arrogance not malice but the untempered fire of a warrior who had not yet learned the wisdom that only time and loss can teach. Several weeks later, a man in simple civilian clothes was volunteering at the VA hospital in San Diego, pushing a book cart from room to room. It was Miller. He had chosen to spend his weekends there, listening to the stories of old soldiers and sailors, men his own age had forgotten. As he turned a corner, he saw a familiar figure sitting in a chair by a window, staring out at the Pacific. It was Dennis Whitaker. He was waiting for a routine checkup. Miller's heart leaped into his throat. He hesitated, then took a deep breath and approached, stopping a respectful few feet away. "Mr. Whitaker," he said quietly. Dennis turned his head, his pale eyes recognizing him instantly. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "Sir," Miller began, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't hide. I wanted to apologize. What I did was inexcusable. There is no excuse." Dennis looked at him for a long moment, studying his face. He saw the genuine remorse, the shame that the young man now carried. He gestured to the empty chair beside him. Miller sat. "Everyone makes mistakes, son," Dennis said, his voice the quiet rasp Miller remembered. "The important thing is what you do after. The important thing is you learn." They sat in silence for a few minutes, watching the waves roll in. "Thank you, sir," Miller finally said. Dennis just nodded again, a small, sad smile touching his lips. "Just do me a favor," he said. "Remember the stories. Tell them to the new guys. Don't let them forget us." "I will," Miller promised, his voice cracking. "I will. If you were moved by this story of quiet courage and lasting honor, please like and share this video. Subscribe to Veteran Valor for more stories about the unassuming heroes who walk among us, and let us know in the comments about a veteran who has impacted your life.